ice so that ships can go.
Yeah.
They're also icebreakers at Target.
I was trying to.
I'm sorry,
Those might
I
be
just say
slightly
that.
different.
I love icebreakers.
Just a little. All right, I'll be back when the LD round is over.
Okay.
Don't let them get too out of hand, Steven.
Lily, don't
I'll
leave.
try
How
not
will we function without you?
You will be
By
okay.
Imagine
listening.
how we're gonna
This
be
is
next
practice
year.
for next year. You will be okay.
Oh no.
Oh my god.
That's a scary thought. Okay.
Yeah,
So the environment.
Okay, wait. This takes like 2 minutes to get ourselves ready.
All right.
They're not ready either.
I could actually also
Why
just
do
like
you
share
think that
this.
Tiffany glass cup
I have a file with an outline. It's probably not a helpful outline.
Whatever you think helps, share it. You can share with Lily. She can send it to us.
Okay. I might do that later. It'll at least cover like what I go over. People ready? Okay. Global. So first of all, talking about global, like when we talk about the environment, we can talk about global warming. I'm pretty sure everyone's at least heard of global warming before or has some idea of what it is. But basically, greenhouse gases trapping heat and make the surface warm up overall. It screws with weather patterns. But what's more important about this is how does this impact out? What are the links to your extinction impacts? Because like that's all we care about in debate. We don't actually care about the physics of what's going on or any of that. So this is the overview of why global warming. The first part of this is just the overview of why global warming is basically the worst impact in the round. So you can get to extinction from global warming a number of different ways. One that you'll hear commonly is ocean acidification. What goes on with that is CO2 in the air will dissolve into the ocean, and if you have a higher particulate count of CO2 in the air, just in general, it'll slowly dissolve into the ocean. The ocean becomes more acidic with that because it's forming carbonic acid, I believe. Yeah. So, the problem with that, now that you're acidifying the ocean, one, it's going to kill reefs, but more importantly, it kills off a lot of fish. You can find different studies that cite this, but specifically Nature, which is a scientific journal, talks about that it could kill off 90 to 100% of fish species. That leads to extinction specifically because it's a loss of a major food source, and it disrupts aquatic and land ecosystems, which tend to interact. So you kill off a lot of animals, and the ecosystems just can't recover from that. Possibly leads to human extinction or just massive death. It also could lead to resource wars because people now have to fight over food. So that's like the first way that you get to horrible impacts. Second, ocean warming. There are a lot of things with the ocean, but the oceans have a lot of power. They cover a lot of the Earth's surface, so they're more impacted by global warming. And the other link into this sort of from like global warming in general is as ice sheets melt, the ocean surface is exposed, and because the ocean surface is darker, it absorbs more energy. More energy leads to a rise in sea temperatures. Again, a Nature study found that about a 2-degree rise in sea temperatures would kill off all aquatic life and would kill off around 50% of land life because of the interactions between the ocean and the land, or like land ecosystems. Now that's just horrendously bad. Like that's a pretty clear link to at least massive
Could you
die-offs.
go back to higher temperature? Wait, how does that darker ocean absorbs more energy?
So, with global warming, the ice sheets start to melt, and then right now the ice sheets reflect a lot of sunlight. Even if you were just to look at a white surface, you'll notice that it reflects more sunlight, but also the ice is partially reflective. So when that's gone, you've got a much larger area to absorb
without the ice
water.
is just there.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
And I'll get to that a little bit more on talking about ocean currents, because they'll do things that screw with ocean currents. Okay, feedback loops. Oh, yeah.
Can you repeat like that stat you had about
Nature
how
one?
2 degrees rise?
Yeah, okay. Nature says that a 2-degree Nature is a scientific journal. Yeah. I kind of just say Nature a lot, but that could be missed. Nature says that a 2-degree rise in ocean temperatures, I think the specific stat would be a 90 to 100% extinction of aquatic life in the ocean, and 50% extinction to land-based species because of the interactions between the ocean and the land. nature has a lot of stuff about how much you screw up the ecosystem if you warm things. Feedback loops. So, the really unfortunate thing, and this also kind of goes into weighing, is global warming has something called feedback loops. These happen one of two ways. One's the idea of the ice melting already, so when you have a slight increase of temperature, you melt more of the ice, which allows more sunlight to heat the ocean and accelerate the melting of ice. The second thing is when you melt ice, especially ice that's been frozen for a long time, it often contains methane or carbon dioxide, which are greenhouse gases. So as you're melting it, you release more into the atmosphere, and at some point it becomes a cycle that feeds back into itself, where even if you could completely stop polluting at that point, you couldn't stop the cycle of global warming. This is bad for two reasons. One, well, in debate it's kind of good because it means you should probably weigh environmental impacts first, because if there's sort of this point of no return, we don't want to go over that. We'd really like to avoid that. But secondly, if we get into a spike, which is put at about 2 degrees warming, is when we'd start to get close to that edge, then the uncontrolled warming just straight out can kill around 80% of land-based life. Yeah.
So for the feedback loops for the melting, you talked about how methane can be released.
Yeah.
Could you go over that a bit?
So there, because the ice formed so long ago, it traps methane inside of it, and when it melts, it just releases little bubbles of methane into the air, or CO2, depending on where you are. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the other reason feedback loops can be, or how feedback loops can be used in debate other than just weighing, are that once you get to the uncontrolled rise, multiple studies, you can look up studies with nature for this, I don't remember the exact statistics on that one, but say that the extreme sort of exponential climb in temperature would be something that animals couldn't move out of fast enough to survive and couldn't adapt fast enough to survive. So it just kills massive amounts of aquatic and land creatures that lead to extinction through not having food and just disrupting the ecosystem enough. If you kill off all bees, crops are going to be in a lot of trouble. Desertification. This one's not extinction, unfortunately. So when we have a general increase in temperature, the land tends to be drier. It's somewhat simple in that, or logically in that, but the effect that this happens. Actually, the more detailed method for that is you shift current zones towards the different poles. So basically, the area that holds deserts normally expands at the center, and what that leads to is a wider desert area where you can't grow food. Obviously, having deserts means, one, you have to use more pollutants or fertilizer and insecticides to keep crops growing there. Two, erosion just leads to areas that you can never really farm. And three, just in general, it decreases farmable land. That's bad, especially with food, because it can cause food shortages. It causes an increase in the price of food, and in general, that becomes really expensive for people to try to sustain. Also, sort of under desertification, or the moving of different climate zones, you see the spread of diseases, especially malaria, something that there's very, very little immunity to in the United States, and that's currently not really in the United States. There are very few cases of it, even near the United States. But as those temperate zones shift closer to the poles, you're going to start to see the spread of that. What's another? There are a couple of, the different tropical diseases will start to shift into areas where they haven't been before, which can be devastating because I'm guessing that none of us in this room have a shot for malaria. And even if we might be able to get it, it still can kill people before we get it under control. Okay, resource and water wars. So, two ways, we kind of talked about resource wars a little bit. This one, you won't always get to extinction, but especially when you're talking about harms to the ocean or harms to either aquatic or land terrestrial ecosystems, what you're going to see is that there are just less natural resources in terms of food, plants, or less ability to grow those resources. Alongside that, you'll see that water is just less common. One, because you're melting the ice, and a warmer temperature means more water will evaporate, more water will go into a salinity or into salt water and be essentially unusable. Also, evidence for that, NASA specifically predicted that if we continue on the temperature increases that we're seeing, we could see a 30 to 150 year drought in the southwestern United States. That's just like warranting for how it could work. Why is that bad? Well, how many of you in history studied the water wars? People died, basically. Similarly with resource wars, if you get to the point at which only certain areas are farmable, people are going to fight over those areas. That leads to tensions between governments. If you want to go for extinction here, which is probably hard, you could say someone's going to launch a nuke over like a little bit of farmland. I doubt that's going to happen, but there would be wars over either water supplies or farmable land. And warrants for this can be different countries in Africa have tribes fighting over land that because it has water, or even governments not necessarily fighting violently, but disagreeing and getting into smaller conflicts just because someone's got the water resource and they like dam it up or something and prevent the others from getting to it. Superstorms. So, seeing why the environment is horrible. Superstorms. Basically, what happens when you warm the ocean is you start to screw with ocean currents, especially when you see more warming on the poles because of the melting ice sheets exposing more water. What we see is that the water that's traditionally flowing up to the poles cooling down and then flowing back down, what, for example, keeps Europe fairly cool year-round, starts to falter. And when those currents falter, there are a couple predictions. One's that they either stop, which would be kind of horrific because we depend on those currents for most of our weather, and the weather becomes really unpredictable if those currents are unpredictable or non-existent. The second hypothesis is that they might reverse. If they reverse, that's possibly even worse because the last time they reversed was the last ice age, which covered Europe in, I think, a 500-foot thick sheet of ice. But basically, if they reverse, you'll start to see interesting effects. And while like the negative team could, or whichever team's against you, could come up and say, "Oh, that's great. That's all for your global warming advantage." It probably doesn't, and you really don't want to find out exactly what it is to have that sort of massive shift in weather. Also, in making weather unpredictable, in general, hurricanes tend to be larger in areas with warmer water. We've seen hurricanes move more northward with warmer temperatures, and basically it just gets to a point where weather becomes less predictable. That's not going to lead to extinction, but that could lead to loss of lives. And if you're going for really environment-heavy impacts, you're probably going to want as many environment impacts as possible. Antibiotic-resistant infections. This one's horrible and scary.
That's super.
Yeah. So, currently our only known response to antibiotic-resistant infections is found from amphibian skin, or we're hoping to be able to derive it from amphibian skin and figure out how to make it. The problem is that antibiotic-resistant infections are increasing in the status quo, and like even though the CDC went and banned hand soaps containing certain chemicals that were meant to be
They developed.
antibacterial. So even though there's a pushback, and even though we're trying to reduce resistant microbes, they're still growing in the status quo, and we're seeing, on average, 100, 200, or 300-ish more deaths per year from resistant strains of bacteria, especially staph. The issue with that is amphibians are an interesting creature, and almost all of the scientists that study amphibians and global warming, combined, say that if we see a global temperature increase of 1 degree, it's going to cause massive die-outs of amphibians. It could possibly cause extinctions of all amphibians. So then we no longer have the ability to derive these compounds and deal with these superbugs, basically.
Yeah.
And Well, that doesn't immediately get horrific if it continues growing, and like we have reasons to think that it would. Eventually, it would lead to extinction or lead to just total collapse of infrastructure because there would be really no treatment. And 1 in about 700,000 people is immune to staph. That's not really good if you've got antibiotic-resistant staph. It also, if you don't want to go quite for extinction, or if you don't want to go for extinction that way, you can go for it disrupting infrastructure, because once it gets into a hospital, or once there's a hospital that has an outbreak, they often have to move people away from that outbreak, section off that hospital, try to get it contained and cleaned up. That makes it really hard to get medical care, and that's especially bad for lower income families because they either can't afford to go to other hospitals or can't get to medical care. Yeah.
Isn't it like it can also spread in the hospital?
Yes. Yeah.
Because like I was just curious thing, and I can talk about super bugs. It's like the
Yeah.
scariest thing ever.
They're horrible. Okay. Sea level rises. We kind of talked about that one a little bit, but essentially, what the argument for sea level rises being bad is that when you just have these ice sheets melting, besides the fact that they can disrupt currents and all that, you also just have the sea level rising. Now, a huge amount of the population lives where these sea levels would rise. Like, maybe in California it's not that big of a deal because, yes, the Bay Area could be flooded with a certain sea level rise, but in areas like India, Indonesia, some countries even would just stop existing if there's enough of a sea level rise. And that becomes problematic because, one, countries start to fight over land, so you get to resource wars and sort of conventional warfare, but also because that's what, like, having that sort of effect continues the cycle of poverty, because honestly, the people that are rich can afford to go buy whatever land they want, but the people that are poor can't really do anything about it, and will get forced to be homeless, get forced into slums, and that's bad because dehumanization's bad. Okay, I think that's an overview of all the global warming impacts. Oh, weighing. Basically, you talked about weighing with Lily a couple weeks ago, right? And you weigh on magnitude, probability, time frame, and reversibility. A lot of those impacts that I talked about are extinction, which means that they have the highest magnitude. On probability, it's extremely probable that we'll see at least some form of the impacts. Maybe not extinction, but we already see refugees from climate change, where people are forced out of their homes, where people are forced to move away because they just can't survive in the current conditions. And we see people dying from storms such as Katrina, which has been hypothesized was at least partially influenced by the climate. So probability is also really high. Time frame, also really high. This is just like, as bad as the environment stuff is, and as much as it's kind of depressing, as a debater, environmental impacts are great because they basically have the highest magnitude, have the highest probability, have one of the shortest time frames. Yeah.
Were like examples of people moving because of climate?
I don't have examples off the top of my head, but if you look up climate refugees, there are a couple stories on it.
Oh.
Yeah. Time frame. There again, you can find different studies. The one that I've used most often is the International Panel on Climate Change. Says that we need a 70% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2020. If we don't meet that goal, they estimate that we'll see over a 2-degree rise in global temperatures, which basically triggers all of the impacts we talked about.
You're all gonna die.
Yeah. Hopefully we won't actually die, but it could happen. Fortunately, it takes a while, but you can just, you can skim over the fact that those impacts take a really long time, or take 50 to 100 years to kick in, and just talk about the fact that in, 4 years-ish, we'll be over a brink that we don't know if we can return from. On reversibility, that's where feedback loops come in. Basically, you can argue that climate change isn't reversible, so it needs to be solved first. I'm a fan of environmental impacts, not everyone is. Okay. Other topics in the environment. Carbon capture technology. This is a response that a lot of people make to, in general, global warming discussions, is that either the status quo is going to solve, we're going to get carbon capture technology, or like maybe their plan has something to do with carbon capture technology. One, at least right now, we know of no carbon capture technology that's effective in terms of the carbon that's output in making the carbon capture technology produces more carbon that's actually absorbed by the technology, at least in a short-ish time span. And two, it would be prohibitively expensive. As much as we'd like to talk about, oh, hey, we could just build artificial trees that take all of this pollution out of the air. How many trees do we have? How many of those could we build? How much is that going to cost us? It's economically not viable, and no country's getting behind it. Also, countries really like to put off stuff and just not care about the environment, so there's not much reason they would move on that right now. Yeah, okay. Biodiversity. Biodiversity simply is like the number of different species that you have in an area. It doesn't come up much in debate. There are two ways it can be talked about in debate. You can talk about it as sort of just a concept and talking about ecosystem collapse if you lose enough biodiversity through hunting, like any sort of different means. The other thing that you'll almost never see in debate, but you should be aware of in case you see it, is biodiversity can be used as a terminal impact, because you can argue that causing extinctions of any sort of species is irresponsible, both on a level of knowledge production and on a level of we don't know what problems they can solve, so sort of a black swan style idea. You probably won't see that, but in case you do, that's what's going on. Is there anything else with that? Oh, reasons to prefer biodiversity. Generally, if people are going to run biodiversity, they'll run the reason that you should prefer it is there's no reversing it. If you lose a species, that species is gone forever and can't necessarily be recreated. Usually, if they're running it, they're going to be running it as some sort of moral or critical argument. So it's probably not something to worry about. I just thought I'd include that in the environment.
How do you respond? Could you say?
What?
How do you respond?
You'd probably respond to it by saying, like, if you have extinction impacts, you could say preservation of the human race is more important, because, like, it's our job to try to prevent the loss of biodiversity, but if we just go extinct, no one's going to be able to do that. And if you have other environmental impacts, you can weigh those against the biodiversity by saying, like, look, you can kill all of the animals by doing whatever your plan does, which is horrible for biodiversity, or you can accept that you're going to have to lose some biodiversity in overall trying to save the majority of it. So generally it'll be arguments sort of the style of, we still are going to preserve biodiversity, just we have to value other things first. Topics about the environment that you'll see. Alternative energy is one. The Arctic Circle could be one. I'll get to that more later. And then just some general knowledge about like coal, natural gas, and emissions. So as emission standards go, natural gas is probably the cleanest that you can get for fossil fuels, while coal is one of the dirtiest. There are a few ways to make coal better or worse. You won't normally see those in debate, really, because people aren't prepared to talk about the environment. Just how it relates to other things, there are certain other chemicals. One of the chemicals that's used in production of batteries is like a greenhouse gas that is 270 times worse than methane. Methane's 4 times worse than CO2. So, I'm not going to do that math, but it's way worse than CO2. How that sort of goes on is you can use that argument when people come up with other energy sources, when people start talking about like how they're going to solve everything with batteries or how they're going to solve everything with nuclear power. A good example on this would be if someone says, oh, we're going to like switch over to nuclear power, you can even respond to that by saying that in the short term we'd have to switch to coal if we say outlaw all natural gas generation or something. Or it could even be used in a response. people will argue that nuclear power is really bad for the environment, and so we should shut off all nuclear power generation. It's about 20% of power generation. So you can then argue, in the short term at least, even if like they can mandate that we use other sources like renewable resources, in the short term we'd switch back to coal or oil probably, because those are the most economically viable or the cheapest, and those are the most readily available. That's really bad because coal puts out a lot of pollution. Okay, alternative energy in just like more general or more specific to alternative energy. There are four main types of alternative energy: biofuels, wind power, solar power, and nuclear power that people talk about. There are a couple others. Oh, hydroelectric. So I guess there are 5. There are a couple others like tidal, but that sort of falls under hydroelectric. The problems with these.
Could you repeat the
Yeah. Okay. So biofuel, solar power, wind power, nuclear power, and hydroelectric power. In no particular order. Any preference on which ones we start with? So, I'm going to start with biofuel. If you're talking about biofuel, there are at least 2 different types of biofuel that you'll want to research and be prepared to talk about. That's ethanol-based biofuel and algae-based biofuel. The primary difference there is that depending on different techniques, but ethanol-based biofuels are generally alcohol mixed with some sort of gasoline, so they're not entirely biofuels. Algae biofuels are much more close to like true biofuels where engines can run purely on that biofuel, but there are still some issues there. Specifically on ethanols, the advantage, of course, is 1, they tend to run in diesel engines or run with diesel, which is just overall cleaner burning usually, and 2, the idea is that there's at least some carbon neutrality because you have to grow the plant, and the plant's absorbing CO2 and turning it into the hydrocarbons that you use, so it reduces the impact. Disadvantages here often come from the fact that it takes a lot of land, it takes a lot of water, it takes a lot of pesticides, it takes a lot of fertilizer to grow that sort of corn. And in addition, it takes it away from the food supply, so it will make food prices go up. When the government subsidized ethanol in, I think it was 2006, I could be wrong on that though, there was a